He lived in a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with tall trees and small houses with neatly trimmed lawns. People in the area were used to seeing him leave early in the morning, always dressed in simple clothes, carrying a briefcase or a bag with a laptop. He didn't talk much to his neighbors, but when he did, he was polite and calm. No one suspected the depths of his past, the things he had seen or the skills he had honed over years of intense training. His house, modest but sturdy, stood at the end of a quiet street. It wasn't flashy, and he didn't care for decoration or extravagance. Inside, everything was neat and organized, almost minimalistic. There was a sense of discipline in the way he lived. His furniture was functional, his belongings carefully placed. Every morning he followed a strict routine. He would wake up before sunrise, run along the quiet streets, do exercises that left most people exhausted, and then return home to shower, dress, and prepare for the day ahead. On weekends, he would sometimes water the small garden in front of his house, making sure every plant was healthy. It was a simple joy, and the neighbors often saw him tending to the flowers, smiling faintly as he worked. People liked him, or at least respected him. He was polite to the mailman, helpful when someone needed assistance with groceries, and careful not to intrude on anyone's business. There was nothing in his behavior that suggested he was capable of extraordinary feats, nothing that would hint at the incredible life he had once lived. The trouble began subtly at first. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses and the streetlights flickered on, he noticed a few teenagers loitering across the street. They were loud, careless, and filled with energy. At first, they didn't bother him. They yelled jokes at each other, laughed, and smoked in the shadows. But over the next few days, he began noticing them paying attention to his house. They would shout insults when they passed, sometimes loud enough to wake him if he was resting. It started with graffiti on the fence. Words scratched into the wood, crude and hateful, leaving no doubt about their intention. The first time he saw it, he didn't react immediately. He studied it, memorized the faces of those who watched him from across the street, and went inside quietly. He didn't yell back, didn't make threats, and didn't let anger control him. People would have called him patient. Others might have thought him timid. But he knew better. He understood the danger of underestimating someone who stayed calm while observing every detail. As days passed, the harassment grew bolder. They would bang on the trash cans near his property, shout at passing cars, and make crude jokes about him and his race. Some neighbors started noticing the tension. A few whispered to each other, wondering why he didn't confront them, why he never called the police. But he didn't need their advice. He had a plan, even if no one knew it yet. Every insult, every action by the gang was being filed away in his mind. Every movement was analyzed and remembered. He was preparing quietly for whatever might come. The man had friends in the neighborhood, people who respected him for his work and calm nature. But even they didn't know what he could do. He had lived through situations that would have broken most people, had faced dangers that no ordinary person could imagine, and had survived. That past was a secret he carried silently. He never boasted, never shared stories of his life in the military. It wasn't pride or arrogance. It was necessity. The world didn't need to know what he could do until it was required. One evening, as he returned from a long run, he noticed a group of the gang gathered near his mailbox. They were laughing and pointing at something, clearly waiting for him. He didn't hurry. He slowed his pace slightly, making sure they could see him, yet he showed no fear. They shouted at him, made crude gestures, and even dared to approach his property line. Most people would have panicked, called for help, or shouted back. He didn't. He simply stopped, looked at them carefully, and let them finish. His calmness unnerved them more than any confrontation could have. Inside the house, he double-checked his doors and windows that night. He didn't feel fear, but he felt the responsibility to protect what was his. His home was not just a shelter. It was a place of peace, a place where he could reflect and rebuild after the hardships of his past. And now it had been targeted. He didn't sleep much that night, not because of fear, but because he was planning. He remembered the lessons from his training, the countless hours of preparation, the drills, the strategies. He knew that confrontation was coming, and he wanted to be ready. Even during these tense times, he continued with his routines. Early morning runs, exercises in the backyard, simple meals prepared with care. Every motion was deliberate, every decision calculated. Neighbors who glanced at his house might have thought he was just another man trying to live his life. Little did they know he was a former Navy SEAL, trained to survive extreme situations, trained to face enemies far more dangerous than a group of local troublemakers. His mind was sharp, his instincts honed, and he was ready to act when the time came. There was a quiet pride in how he carried himself. He didn't need to intimidate anyone because his confidence spoke without words. He understood that aggression could be dangerous, but patience and planning were far more powerful. He watched the gang carefully, noting their routines, their weaknesses, the way they communicated. Every laugh, every sneer, every act of vandalism was an opportunity to learn about them. He didn't let anger guide him. Logic and experience did. At night, when the street was silent, he would sit by the window, looking at the neighborhood he had chosen as home. He thought about the life he had led before this, the missions, the challenges, the dangers that had shaped him. Those experiences were etched into his muscles, his reflexes, his mind. They had made him strong, disciplined, and capable of surviving anything. Yet in this quiet neighborhood, he had learned the value of patience, of observing, of letting others reveal their intentions before acting. The tension in the air was growing. The gang became bolder with each passing day, but he remained calm. The neighbors whispered about what they called his quiet bravery, but no one truly understood what it meant. They didn't know about the missions he had completed, the enemies he had faced, or the skills he possessed. They only saw a calm, disciplined man who refused to be intimidated. In the quiet moments, he reflected on what justice truly meant. He didn't want revenge for the sake of pride or ego. He wanted balance, to ensure that those who brought harm and hatred into his life understood that their actions had consequences. But he also knew that brute force alone was not the answer. Strategy, patience, and timing were everything. And he had learned those lessons well, in the most intense circumstances imaginable. The first part of the story ends with him standing at the edge of his backyard, looking across the quiet street, watching the gang gather and laugh as the sun sets. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He simply observed, breathing slowly, planning every step. The calm before the storm was tense, heavy, but he was ready. He was ready not just to protect his home, but to teach a lesson that would be remembered. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, and the gang certainly didn't, but the man they underestimated was far more than he appeared. And so, life continued in the quiet neighborhood. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. The streetlights flickered on one by one, and the man prepared silently for the challenge that was coming. No one could predict what would happen next, but one thing was certain: he would not be intimidated. He would not back down, and the world was about to witness the strength of a man who had been trained to survive, to protect, and to act with precision when the time came. The days after the first incidents were heavier, filled with an unspoken tension that lingered in the neighborhood. The man could feel it in the air, a shift that warned of trouble. The gang had grown bolder, their actions becoming more aggressive and reckless. They were no longer satisfied with graffiti or shouting insults. They seemed to test the boundaries, probing for weakness, expecting that he would react in anger or fear. But he remained calm, observing them with the same patience and discipline that had carried him through years of rigorous training. One evening, as he returned from his regular run, he noticed the gang gathered near his driveway. There were more of them this time, and they carried bottles and sticks, tools for mischief and destruction. Their laughter was louder, more mocking, a display of confidence built on the assumption that he was ordinary, defenseless. He slowed his pace and let them see him, but there was no panic, no fear in his eyes. The calmness in his demeanor was deliberate, a way to unsettle them without raising suspicion. He entered his home and went about his routine quietly. He checked the locks on every door and window, not because he felt vulnerable, but because he was thorough. His mind raced through scenarios, anticipating the gang's next move. He remembered lessons from his past missions, moments when timing and preparation made the difference between success and failure. He knew that if he acted too soon, he might lose the advantage, so he waited, patient, gathering information. Later that night, the gang struck. They came in the dark, shadows moving across the yard, tools in hand, faces masked by hooded sweatshirts. They were careless, their movements loud and chaotic, a stark contrast to his controlled observation. They smashed the mailbox, tipped over trash cans, and kicked at the front door. Their intention was clear. They wanted to scare him, to assert dominance over a man they assumed was weak. But they did not know the strength hidden behind his calm exterior. He watched from inside, his eyes sharp, his body poised. He didn't rush out, didn't shout, didn't panic. Instead, he assessed each of them, noting their positions, their behavior, the weapons they held. He calculated distances, angles, and opportunities. Each detail was important. In moments like these, his training kicked in naturally. Years of preparation, of facing far greater dangers, made him see situations in ways others could not. The gang thought they had the upper hand, but they were stepping into a trap of observation and strategy. The destruction escalated. Windows were broken, the front door splintered from repeated kicks, and spray paint covered the walls. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the quiet street, drawing attention from neighbors. Some peered from behind curtains, frightened and unsure of what to do. Police had been called in the past for minor disturbances, but response time was slow, and by the time anyone arrived, the gang would be gone. The man knew this and relied on his own skills to handle the situation. He moved carefully inside, making sure the house was safe for himself and anyone who might be nearby. He checked for hidden dangers, listening for subtle sounds that might indicate a trap or ambush. Every sense was alert, every instinct active. He was calm, but his mind was focused like a laser, processing information at a speed no ordinary person could match. His body, conditioned through years of rigorous training, was ready to react instantly if needed. Outside, the gang grew bolder. They tore through the yard, kicking over garden decorations and breaking flower pots. They laughed, thinking this display would intimidate him. But he had anticipated this. Cameras he had installed discreetly captured every moment, every angle, providing him with evidence and insight into their behavior. The gang had no idea that their every action was being recorded, that their overconfidence would soon be their downfall. As the night deepened, they tried to force their way inside. They pried at windows, attempted to jimmy the locks, and shouted threats. The man did not confront them physically. Instead, he used his training in patience and strategy. He stayed out of sight, controlling the narrative of the encounter. His presence was felt even if unseen. The gang began to sense something was off, a subtle tension that made them hesitate, a feeling that the man they were trying to intimidate was far more capable than they imagined. The destruction continued for hours. By the time the sun began to rise, parts of his house were badly damaged. Windows were shattered, doors broken, and walls covered in graffiti. Despite the chaos, he remained composed. He moved through the wreckage, assessing the damage, planning the repairs, and noting the gang's patterns. Each act of vandalism, each reckless movement was stored in his mind, forming a complete picture of the group's behavior and weaknesses. Neighbors began to emerge cautiously, seeing the aftermath. They whispered among themselves, expressing shock and fear. Some suggested calling the authorities, while others simply shook their heads, unsure of what could be done. But he didn't panic. He wasn't helpless. In fact, he had never felt more prepared. Every aspect of the situation was under his control, even if it didn't appear that way. He spent the morning documenting everything. Photographs, notes, and videos. He collected all the evidence he would need. But he also reflected on the psychology of the attackers. Their confidence, their aggression, their assumption that he would be scared. All of it revealed their weaknesses. They were loud and reckless, but predictable. That predictability would be their undoing. He could see it clearly as if he were watching a simulation he had run hundreds of times in training. That night, the gang returned. They expected him to be vulnerable, expecting fear or panic. But when they approached, they were met with a different kind of calm, a stillness that made them uneasy. He did not confront them with words or violence. Instead, he remained unseen, observing, letting their own actions reveal their strategy. Small mistakes began to appear. A missed step, a loud movement, a moment of hesitation. These were the openings he had been waiting for. The gang's frustration grew. They shouted and kicked, trying to provoke a reaction. But the man stayed silent, invisible, analyzing every move. He remembered the training that had kept him alive in far more dangerous circumstances. Missions in hostile environments, situations where every decision mattered, and every second counted. This was nothing compared to what he had endured. And yet it was personal, a violation of the life he had built for himself, and he would respond with precision when the time came. By the end of the night, the gang had left, believing they had succeeded, but in reality, they had revealed everything the man needed to know. Their routines, their habits, their overconfidence, all were now clear. He moved quietly through his damaged home, making temporary repairs, ensuring that nothing would be left vulnerable. Every movement was deliberate, every decision calculated. He was not angry, he was ready. The next morning he walked through his yard, noting the remains of broken items, shattered glass, and graffiti. He cleaned carefully, methodically, turning destruction into an opportunity to prepare for what was next. He set up additional security measures, reinforcing doors and windows, adding subtle surveillance that would capture every action of the gang. This was not revenge yet, it was preparation, ensuring that when he acted, it would be precise and effective. Despite the damage, he maintained his routines. He ran, he exercised, he ate, he planned. His mind was focused on strategy, on observation, on understanding the people who had chosen to target him. He knew their aggression was fueled by ignorance and hate, and that understanding them was more powerful than confronting them blindly. Patience had always been his greatest weapon, and he wielded it now with careful discipline. The neighborhood began to whisper about the man's resilience. They saw him moving through the wreckage, calm and composed, and wondered how he could be so unshaken. Some admired him silently, others were fearful, but none could comprehend the depth of his skills, the extent of his training, or the experiences that had shaped him. They only saw the calm, and that alone unsettled them. As days passed, the man studied the gang's movements from a distance. He observed when they gathered, how they communicated, and where their weaknesses lay. He did not rush into confrontation, because timing was everything. Every move he made was deliberate, every decision precise. He knew that when the moment came, it would not be about anger or force, it would be about strategy, preparation, and execution. The destruction of his home had not broken him. Instead, it had sharpened his focus, clarified his purpose, and reinforced the discipline that had carried him through far worse situations. He moved through the neighborhood with quiet confidence, aware of the danger but not intimidated by it. He understood that appearances were deceiving, that his calm exterior hid skills and experience the gang could not even imagine. By the end of the week, the gang had become restless. Their repeated failures to provoke him had frustrated them. They were loud, reckless, and unpredictable. But the man had learned everything he needed. He had studied their patterns, anticipated their moves, and prepared for every possible scenario. He was ready, not with anger, but with control, with precision, with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far greater threats and survived. And so life continued, at least on the surface. The neighborhood still hummed with normalcy. Children played in the streets, neighbors went about their routines, unaware of the storm that was quietly preparing itself in the house at the end of the street. Inside, the man moved through his damaged home, planning, observing, preparing. The calm before the storm was not gone. It had transformed into readiness. Every step, every thought, every decision was part of a plan that was just beginning to take shape. The destruction of his house had been violent and frightening to others, but to him it was an opportunity to demonstrate skill, patience, and intelligence far beyond what the gang could imagine. He would not be intimidated. He would not act recklessly. And when the time came, those who had believed him weak would realize the truth, that the man they had attacked was not ordinary, and that the consequences of their actions would be far greater than they had ever imagined. The man moved through his home quietly, walking over broken glass and splintered wood without hesitation. The chaos of the previous nights had left his house damaged, but it had not shaken him. He could feel the tension in the air, and it was not just the tension from the gang outside. There was a deeper, heavier sense of purpose now, a weight that pressed against his mind and made him focus more sharply than ever. He had lived through situations that would have broken most people, and he knew that this challenge, though dangerous, was manageable. That morning, as sunlight filtered through the partially broken windows, he sat at the kitchen table and examined the notes he had made over the past week. He had mapped every movement of the gang, recorded their patterns, and analyzed their weaknesses. Each observation was stored carefully in his mind, catalogued with precision. He was not angry, not yet. Anger could cloud judgment. Patience, strategy, and timing were far more powerful. He allowed himself a quiet smile, understanding that the gang had revealed everything he needed without realizing it. As he moved through the house, repairing what he could temporarily, memories began to surface, memories of a life that most people could not imagine. He had trained as a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite and highly skilled forces in the world. Years of intense physical and mental conditioning had prepared him for extreme danger, for situations where survival seemed impossible. He had faced enemies far more dangerous than a group of misguided, ignorant men. He had survived missions that demanded precision, strategy, and courage. And now, in his quiet neighborhood, he realized that those lessons would finally serve a very personal purpose. He remembered the first day of training, the grueling exercises, the endless drills that pushed his body and mind to their limits. Every day had been a test of endurance, focus, and resilience. He had learned to move silently, to observe without being seen, to anticipate danger before it arrived. The skills that had once saved lives in foreign lands were now quietly being sharpened again, for a different kind of mission, one that hit closer to home. After weeks of quiet observation, he began taking small, deliberate steps. He reinforced the remaining doors and windows, ensuring that any further attempt at entry would be difficult if not impossible. He set up discreet cameras and sensors, devices that could record every movement of the gang without drawing attention. Every piece of evidence would be captured, every mistake noted. He was creating a controlled environment, turning the neighborhood into a stage where he would dictate the outcome. He also began running simulations in his mind, imagining every possible scenario. How the gang might attack, what mistakes they might make, how he could respond without risking unnecessary harm to himself. Each scenario was analyzed and practiced mentally until he could anticipate their moves instinctively. This was not about revenge for him. It was about control, about ensuring that those who had caused destruction understood the consequences of their actions. One afternoon, as he sat quietly on the back porch, he noticed the gang gathering again across the street. They were careless, loud, and overconfident, just as he had expected. He observed them without moving, without reacting, letting them reveal their intentions. Their arrogance was clear. They assumed that he would be intimidated, that he would act recklessly. But he did nothing. His calmness unnerved them in ways they could not articulate. They were stepping into a situation where every movement they made was being analyzed and logged. The man began to set small traps, not physical ones, but psychological ones. He understood the weaknesses of human behavior, the ways in which fear, arrogance, and impatience could lead to mistakes. He used lights, sounds, and subtle movements to manipulate their perception, to make them hesitate, to make them reveal themselves in ways that would be useful later. Every action he took was deliberate, every detail calculated. His goal was not chaos, but precision, and he knew that when the time came, the balance of power would shift entirely. As he moved through the damaged house, he thought about the lessons his past had taught him. Courage was not about brute force. It was about patience, strategy, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Strength was not only physical but mental, the ability to control one's emotions and remain focused even when the world seemed chaotic. These lessons, learned in life or death situations, now applied to his quiet neighborhood, proving that true skill and preparation could overcome ignorance and hatred. He spent the following days studying the gang from a distance. He learned the routines of each member, the way they interacted, their weaknesses, and their overconfidence. One of them had a habit of checking his phone constantly. Another laughed too loudly and carelessly, revealing his location before making a move. Every detail mattered. He observed without being seen, a silent presence that could act with precision when necessary. At night, he trained in his backyard, using improvised exercises to maintain peak physical condition. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, and efficient. He moved with speed and precision, practicing techniques that most people could only imagine. Even as he exercised, he planned, anticipating how he might confront the gang if they came again. His movements were fluid, his mind sharp, and his determination unwavering. One evening, the gang made a mistake. They left evidence of their plans in plain sight: a note, a tool, a discarded piece of clothing. He collected it quietly, examining every detail. It was a small thing, but in his hands it became a piece of the larger puzzle. Every piece of information he gathered brought him closer to understanding them completely. He was preparing not for a random act of violence, but for a controlled, precise response that would ensure the safety of his home and the lesson he intended to teach. As the days passed, his confidence grew. The gang, unaware of the depth of his training and the intelligence behind his calm demeanor, continued to escalate their attacks, thinking that he was weak or intimidated. But each act of aggression only sharpened his focus, provided more information, and strengthened his resolve. He was not motivated by anger, but by strategy. He understood that the true power lay in patience and preparation, not in rash action. The man began to think about the psychological aspect of the situation. He knew that fear, confusion, and uncertainty could be as powerful as physical force. By remaining calm and composed, he was already gaining an advantage over the gang. Every hesitation they displayed, every careless movement they made was a step toward their own undoing. He could see it clearly, and he was patient enough to let it unfold naturally. He also considered the neighborhood. He wanted to protect not only his home, but the quiet streets and the people who lived there. While the gang had not yet targeted others, their behavior was dangerous and unpredictable. By preparing carefully, he was creating a barrier of safety, ensuring that when the time came, he could act decisively to stop them without unnecessary harm. It was a calculated approach, a reflection of the discipline and intelligence that had defined his past life. As night fell, he watched from the window once again. The gang moved through the streets unaware that they were being studied, their every action analyzed. He could see their weaknesses, their mistakes, their patterns. He did not rush to confront them. He knew that timing was everything, that a single moment of hesitation on his part could have consequences. He allowed them to reveal themselves fully, building a clear picture of their behavior before acting. Inside, he moved quietly, preparing for what he knew would come. He reinforced doors and windows further, checked his surveillance equipment, and planned contingencies for every possible scenario. He was meticulous, thorough, and disciplined, leaving nothing to chance. His mind, sharpened by years of elite training, worked like a precision instrument, calculating risks, predicting outcomes, and preparing solutions. One evening, a memory from his past returned vividly. He had been on a mission where failure was not an option, where every second mattered, and where the lives of his team depended on his decisions. The pressure had been immense, the danger extreme, yet he had succeeded. That experience reminded him that he could handle this situation. The stakes were different, but the principles were the same: calm, focus, strategy, and precision. He was ready to apply them. The gang, still unaware of the man's true capabilities, continued their reckless behavior. They assumed he was ordinary, that they could intimidate him with noise, vandalism, and threats. They did not know that each act of aggression was teaching him more about their weaknesses, their patterns, and their predictability. They were walking into a situation where the outcome had already been determined, not by chance, but by the skill and preparation of the man they had chosen to provoke. By the end of the week, he had everything in place. Every observation had been logged, every detail analyzed, and every contingency planned. He had created a controlled environment where he could act with precision, turning the gang's own mistakes against them. The calm before the storm had transformed into readiness, the quiet patience of a trained mind preparing for action. As he looked out over his backyard one last time before night fell, he felt a sense of clarity. The gang believed they had power, but they had only revealed themselves. The destruction of his home had not weakened him. It had strengthened him. Every detail, every mistake, every reckless act had been noted, stored, and analyzed. He was ready, not with anger, not with recklessness, but with the discipline, skill, and intelligence of someone who had faced far greater dangers and survived. The quiet neighborhood, still unaware of the storm building within one of its own homes, continued its nightly rhythm. Lights flickered in windows, the wind rustled the trees, and the streets remained calm. But inside the house at the end of the street, A man prepared, poised, and ready. The stage was set, the plans carefully laid, and the moment was approaching when the gang would realize that the man they had underestimated was not only capable of defending himself, but of teaching a lesson they would never forget. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The man had waited for this moment with patience, and now the streets seemed to hold their breath, as if sensing the tension that had built over days and weeks. The gang had grown careless, overconfident, and reckless, just as he had predicted. They believed he was ordinary, a man they could intimidate, and that arrogance was their greatest weakness. He moved silently through his house, checking each room, making sure that every door and window was secure, and that every piece of equipment he had set up was functioning perfectly. He had prepared for this carefully. Each camera, each sensor, each hidden recording device had been placed with precision, capturing angles and movements that the gang could not even imagine. He knew their habits, their routines, and their weaknesses. Every act of vandalism, every careless movement had been noted, logged, and analyzed. He was ready to act, but he knew that timing was crucial. The moment had to be right. A premature action could ruin everything. The gang appeared across the street as if on cue. They moved in small groups, laughing loudly, their movements reckless and predictable. They had no idea that the man they thought weak was watching every step, learning, waiting, and preparing to respond. He stayed in the shadows, unseen, letting their arrogance guide them into mistakes. One of them kicked a trash can too hard. Another shouted carelessly, revealing his position. Each error was a piece of the puzzle falling perfectly into place. He began with subtle psychological tactics. Lights flickered briefly in the corners of the yard, a sound of movement here, a shadow there. The gang froze, unsure of what they were seeing. Their confidence wavered slightly, and hesitation crept into their actions. He did not confront them physically yet. Instead, he allowed their own fear and uncertainty to grow, manipulating the situation without them realizing it. He was in control, even if they did not know it. Small, deliberate traps had been set days before. He had anticipated where they would go, what they would do, and how they would react. A loose board here, a hidden sensor there, a carefully positioned light. These minor details created a sense of confusion and fear for the gang. They stumbled, laughed nervously, whispered to each other, unsure of what was happening. The man watched quietly, his heart steady, his mind focused. This was not chaos. It was strategy. Hours passed as he observed them. Their frustration grew. Their mistakes multiplied. One member tried to climb over the broken fence, only to find it partially reinforced in a way that slowed him down and drew attention to his vulnerability. Another tripped over a garden decoration the man had moved deliberately to a specific spot. Each minor setback for the gang added to the man's advantage, weakening their confidence while strengthening his understanding of their behavior. Finally, the moment arrived. The gang had gathered near the street corner, planning their next act of vandalism. The man had identified the leader, a tall, loud individual who constantly barked orders. He knew this person's habits and movements better than the man realized. He chose this moment carefully, moving silently out of the house, unseen and unnoticed. His movements were precise, controlled, and fluid, the result of years of training. Every step was deliberate, every motion calculated. He approached from a shadowed side of the yard, staying out of sight. When the gang's leader shouted instructions, the man acted. Using his training in restraint and control, he moved quickly to create a sense of fear and dominance. A sudden sound, a shadow moving in a way they could not anticipate, caused the gang to stop and look around in panic. Their overconfidence began to crumble. They were no longer sure of their surroundings, no longer sure of their safety. The man's calm presence, hidden yet powerful, had changed the entire dynamic. The gang began to scatter, some running back toward the street, others looking for cover. He didn't chase recklessly. Instead, he observed, allowing their own panic to guide them into mistakes. One member ran into a parked car, another tripped over a curb. Each error reinforced the man's control. Each movement predicted and anticipated. He was not acting out of anger or rage. He was acting with precision, discipline, and focus. At one point, the gang tried to regroup, thinking they could intimidate him by staying together. But he had already anticipated this. Using subtle movements, shadows, and sounds, he created confusion and fear. They stumbled into each other, tripped over obstacles, and shouted in frustration. The leader, now desperate, attempted to approach the house directly, but the man was ready. With a few carefully timed steps and movements, he intercepted the path. Unseen but undeniably present, the gang froze again, realizing that the man they had underestimated was not only aware of them, but fully in control of the situation. Their arrogance had been replaced by fear, their confidence replaced by hesitation. The man could see it in their body language, the nervous glances, the small mistakes, the uncertainty in their movements. He allowed this tension to build, understanding that fear and confusion were powerful tools. He didn't need to fight them physically. His presence alone, his control of the environment, and his ability to manipulate the situation psychologically were enough. He let the gang make their own mistakes, fall into their own traps, and reveal their weaknesses. Every error they made was noted, stored, and used to reinforce his strategy. He was a step ahead, always observing, always calculating, always ready. Hours seemed to stretch as the gang continued to falter. They whispered to each other, uncertain, frustrated, and afraid. The man moved quietly, ensuring that he remained hidden while maintaining complete control over the unfolding events. His calmness, his patience, and his precision made the gang doubt themselves, doubt each other, and doubt the situation entirely. He was invisible yet undeniable, a silent force that dominated without direct confrontation. Eventually, the gang began to retreat, their confidence shattered, their cohesion broken. They stumbled through the streets, unsure of where to go or what to do. The man observed them until they disappeared from sight, making sure that no further immediate threat existed. Only then did he allow himself to move freely outside, assessing the impact of his actions. He was calm, not triumphant, understanding that this was just one stage in a larger plan. The lesson had been taught, but vigilance would remain essential. Afterward, he returned to his home and began cleaning up, methodically and efficiently. The house was still damaged, but the chaos had been contained and the threat neutralized for the moment. He repaired minor breaks, reinforced security measures, and made plans for long-term solutions. Every action was deliberate, every decision considered. He reflected on what had occurred, analyzing the gang's behavior, their mistakes, and the effectiveness of his strategies. He also considered the neighborhood. His actions had been controlled, precise, and designed to prevent unnecessary harm. The people around him were unaware of the full scope of what had just occurred, but they would notice the changes in the gang's behavior. The quiet streets would become safer. The reckless individuals would think twice before causing further trouble. His goal was not to instill fear without reason, but to restore balance, safety, and respect. The man spent the following days monitoring the gang quietly. Their behavior changed immediately. They became cautious, hesitant, and far less confident. Their overconfidence had been broken, their reckless arrogance replaced by uncertainty. This shift in behavior confirmed the effectiveness of his strategy. He had not needed to escalate the situation recklessly. His discipline, training, and observation had done the work. During this time, he continued his routines. He ran, exercised, and trained, keeping his body and mind sharp. He maintained his focus, understanding that vigilance was essential. The gang, though temporarily subdued, remained a potential threat. He prepared for any scenario, reinforcing his home, strengthening his surveillance, and refining his strategy. Every movement, every decision, every step was deliberate, a reflection of the discipline that had carried him through his past experiences. He also reflected on the lessons he had learned from his Navy SEAL training. True strength was not about fighting recklessly, but about patience, strategy, and control. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act decisively and intelligently in the face of danger. These principles had guided him through life and death missions, and now they guided him in protecting his home and neighborhood. Neighbors began to notice a subtle change. The gang no longer dared to loiter near his property. Their behavior had shifted from aggressive to cautious, their confidence replaced by hesitation. Some neighbors whispered about the man's quiet strength, about the calm and discipline he displayed. No one fully understood the depth of his skills or the experiences that had shaped him, but they could sense the power that lay beneath his calm exterior. The man moved through his home with deliberate purpose. He repaired, reinforced, and prepared. He trained, observed, and strategized. Every action was part of a larger plan. Every decision calculated, every movement precise. He had not only defended his home, but he had also reshaped the behavior of those who had threatened it. His presence, patience, and intelligence had turned the situation completely in his favor. As night fell once again, he looked out over his quiet neighborhood. The streets seemed peaceful, but he knew better. He remained vigilant, aware that the situation could change at any moment. Yet he also felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The gang had learned their first lesson. They had been outmatched, outsmarted, and subdued without the need for reckless force. The balance had shifted, and the neighborhood was safer because of it. The calm he maintained was not ordinary. It was the result of discipline, experience, and preparation. He had used every skill at his disposal: observation, strategy, psychology, and precision to regain control. The gang, once bold and reckless, had become cautious, hesitant, and uncertain. Their overconfidence had been broken, and the man had done so without unnecessary confrontation. He returned inside, checking the cameras and reviewing footage of the night's events. Every detail had been recorded, every mistake documented. He knew the gang had revealed their weaknesses, and he had gathered information that would be useful in the future if needed. His strategy had worked perfectly, turning their aggression into their own undoing. By the time he went to bed, the neighborhood was quiet once more. The streets were calm, and the gang had retreated, their behavior forever changed. Inside the house, the man reflected on what had occurred. He had not needed to escalate the situation recklessly. His discipline, patience, and skill had been enough. The lesson had been taught, and the stage was set for the final chapter of this story. The days after his strategic actions had passed quietly. The neighborhood seemed calmer, the streets less chaotic, but the man knew better than to assume the threat was gone. The gang had been cautious, hesitant, even scared, but their recklessness was only paused, not eliminated. He remained vigilant, watching their patterns, studying their behavior, and preparing for any attempt to regain control. He understood that true resolution required patience, planning, and precision. Each morning he followed his disciplined routine. He ran through the streets quietly, his senses alert to every sound, every movement, every detail. He trained in his backyard, honing both strength and agility, but also rehearsing mental strategies for observation and control. His calm demeanor hid a mind constantly at work, analyzing, predicting, and preparing. Every day brought new opportunities to observe the gang and to reinforce his control over the situation. The gang had started to make small moves again, testing boundaries, poking at his defenses, but this time their efforts were cautious, hesitant. They had learned the first lesson, but now it was time to teach them the second, one they would never forget. He had gathered enough information to anticipate their actions and expose their weaknesses completely. Every member of the gang had habits, routines, and predictable behaviors. He knew them all, and he was ready to act decisively. One afternoon, as they gathered near a street corner, he observed them quietly from his house. Their leader, still loud and confident, was trying to rally the others, but their movements lacked the reckless boldness of before. The man noticed subtle signs of anxiety, glances over their shoulders, whispered conversations, sudden hesitations. They were aware at some level that they were being watched, but they did not know the depth of his awareness nor the skill and discipline behind it. He moved carefully, almost invisibly, as he prepared to confront them. There was no need for brute force. He had learned that control, strategy, and timing were far more effective than aggression. He had already established dominance in the previous encounters. Now he would consolidate it, ensuring that the gang could no longer threaten him or the neighborhood. His movements were deliberate, precise, each step calculated for maximum effect with minimal risk. The first of their mistakes came quickly. One member, attempting to approach the house, stepped into a spot the man had anticipated. A soft noise, a flicker of shadow, caused him to hesitate and lose balance, drawing attention from the others. The man observed quietly, waiting for the panic to spread. It did exactly as predicted. The gang's leader shouted orders, but the voices were unsure, hesitant, and confused. Their cohesion was breaking down. Using his knowledge of their habits, he began to manipulate the environment further. Lights flickered, sounds echoed subtly, and shadows shifted in ways that seemed random but were controlled by him. The gang's confusion grew, their confidence evaporating. They stumbled over obstacles, ran into each other, and whispered nervously. Their overconfidence, which had been their greatest strength, had become their weakness. Every movement they made was being guided by his preparation. each mistake reinforcing his control. He stepped outside carefully, remaining hidden in shadows, invisible to their eyes but fully aware of their positions. His presence was a silent force, dominating the situation without a single act of direct aggression. The gang froze when they sensed him, their confidence crumbling further. The leader, trying to regain control, barked commands, but his own fear and hesitation were apparent. The man had turned the psychological advantage entirely in his favor. One by one, the gang began to make mistakes. One tripped over a hidden object, another ran into a parked car, a third shouted in frustration and revealed their location. Each misstep allowed the man to guide the situation further, subtly corralling them into positions where they could not escape. He did not need to fight them physically. Their own actions, manipulated by his careful planning, were enough to neutralize the threat. The culmination came when the leader, desperate to regain control, attempted to charge directly at the man's property. The man anticipated this perfectly. Using a combination of calm movement and subtle intimidation, he caused the leader to freeze in place, unsure of how to proceed. The rest of the gang looked on, confused and panicked, realizing that their leader was no longer in control. Fear had taken the place of arrogance, hesitation the place of boldness. At this moment, the man revealed himself fully. He stepped into view, calm and composed, his posture confident, his eyes focused. The gang froze entirely, stunned by the presence of someone they had underestimated so completely. There was no aggression in his stance, no unnecessary threat. Yet the weight of his discipline, skill, and preparedness was undeniable. They realized too late that the quiet man they had mocked and attacked was a force far beyond their understanding. The leader tried to speak, to assert authority, but the words faltered in his throat. The others looked to him, seeking guidance, but the cracks in their confidence were obvious. The man did not shout, did not threaten. His calm, controlled demeanor conveyed the message with clarity. They were outmatched, and any further aggression would be entirely their responsibility. They had underestimated him, and the consequences had become clear. One by one, the gang began to retreat. They stumbled, whispered among themselves, and tried to escape the psychological dominance that had overtaken them. The man allowed them to leave, observing their movements carefully, ensuring that none of them posed an immediate threat. He did not need to escalate further. Their fear, confusion, and the subtle control he exerted had already neutralized the situation. The lesson had been taught decisively and without unnecessary force. After they had left, the man returned to his home and began the process of repair and reflection. The house, still bearing the marks of previous destruction, was a reminder of the challenges he had faced. He cleaned up debris, reinforced the damaged sections, and reviewed the footage from his cameras. Every mistake the gang had made, every movement they had revealed had been documented. He had transformed chaos into understanding, disorder into control. The neighborhood began to notice subtle changes. The streets, once noisy with the gang's antics, were quieter. The people around him whispered about the man's calm strength, the quiet confidence that seemed to dominate the area. No one fully understood what had occurred, but they sensed the shift in power. The gang's arrogance had been broken, their recklessness replaced by caution. The man's discipline and skill had restored balance. He reflected on the entire experience, thinking about the lessons it had reinforced. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to remain calm and focused in the face of it. Strength was not about aggression, but about control, discipline, and strategy. Patience, observation, and preparation could achieve far more than brute force ever could. These were lessons he had learned long ago, applied now in a context closer to home, proving their universal truth. In the days that followed, the man rebuilt what he could. Windows were replaced, doors repaired, graffiti removed. He reinforced security systems and set up long-term surveillance to ensure that no further threats could catch him off guard. He maintained his routines, running, exercising, observing, but now with a renewed sense of peace. The neighborhood had been tested and the balance restored not through chaos or violence, but through skill, intelligence, and calm determination. He also thought about the gang and what they had learned. They had assumed he was weak, ordinary, someone who could be intimidated. They had acted recklessly, driven by arrogance and ignorance. Now they would carry the memory of their mistakes, the realization that appearances could be deceiving, that patience and skill could overcome aggression and hate. The lesson had been taught without unnecessary cruelty, but with absolute clarity. The quiet neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy. Children played in the streets, neighbors went about their daily routines, and life continued. Yet beneath the surface, things had changed. Respect, discipline, and awareness had replaced arrogance, recklessness, and ignorance. The man who had been underestimated and attacked had become a silent guardian, a force that ensured the safety of the streets and the people within them. He moved through his home each day with quiet purpose. The damage left behind by the gang was repaired, but it also served as a reminder of the resilience he had demonstrated. He continued his training, his routines, his observation, understanding that vigilance was a continuous process. The world could always present new challenges, but he was prepared. Discipline, patience, strategy, and calmness would guide him through anything that came next. Neighbors occasionally approached him, commenting on his calm demeanor and the quiet strength they sensed. He responded politely, but without revealing the full scope of his experiences. There was no need. The impact of his actions was evident in the streets, in the behavior of those who had once threatened the peace, and in the renewed sense of security that now pervaded the neighborhood. The man reflected on the entire journey, understanding the contrast between appearances and reality. The gang had seen a quiet, unassuming man in assumed weakness. In reality, he was disciplined, highly trained, and capable of handling challenges far greater than what they could present. The lesson was clear. Underestimating someone based on appearance could lead to consequences far beyond imagination. Even as life returned to a quiet rhythm, he remained watchful. The peace he had restored was real, but it was not taken for granted. He knew that vigilance, preparation, and calm determination were keys to maintaining security and balance. Every day was an opportunity to reinforce discipline, to strengthen the home and neighborhood, and to ensure that respect and order prevailed. In the end, the neighborhood thrived once more. The streets were safe, the homes secure, and the people could move freely without fear of harassment or violence. The gang had been subdued, their arrogance replaced by caution, and the man whose calm and discipline had guided the entire process returned to his routines, quietly ensuring that peace would last. He had faced threats, destruction, and hate, but he had not succumbed to anger or panic. He had acted with patience, strategy, and precision, turning chaos into control, fear into understanding, and aggression into a lesson. The neighborhood, the people, and the man himself were stronger for it. Respect had been earned, peace had been restored, and the story concluded with the quiet power of discipline, intelligence, and calm determination. The man finally sat by the window one evening, watching the streets bathed in golden sunlight. Children laughed in the distance, neighbors moved about peacefully, and the quiet neighborhood thrived. He smiled faintly, understanding that appearances could be deceiving, that discipline and skill could overcome arrogance and hate, and that true strength lay in patience, observation, and calm action. The battle was over, the lesson learned, and the neighborhood safe, all because a man who had once faced the impossible had quietly prepared, observed, and acted with precision.